This content at the same time counts as a moral essentiality or as duty. For pure duty, as was found when testing laws, is utterly indifferent to any content and tolerates any content. Here it has, at the same time, the essential form of being for self, and this form of individual conviction is nothing else but consciousness of the emptiness of pure duty and of the fact that pure duty is only a moment, that its substantiality is a predicate which has its subject in the individual, whose caprice gives it its content and can associate every content with this form and attach its conscientiousness to the content. An individual increases his property in a certain way. It is everybody's duty to provide for the support of himself and his family, and no less to have regard to the possibility of being useful to his fellow men and of doing good to those in need. The individual is aware that this is a duty, for this content is directly contained in his certainty of himself. Furthermore, he perceives that he fulfills this duty in this particular case. Others, perhaps, hold this specific way of behaving to be humbug. They hold to other aspects of the concrete case. He, however, holds firmly to this aspect because he is conscious of the increase of property as a pure duty. Thus, what others call violence and wrongdoing is the fulfillment of the individual's duty to maintain his independence in face of others. What they call cowardice is the duty of supporting life and the possibility of being useful to others. But what they call courage violates both duties. But cowardice cannot be so inept as to not know that the preservation of life and the possibility of being useful to others are duties, so inept as to not be convinced of the moral obligatoriness of its action and not to know that this obligatoriness consists in knowing it to be such. Otherwise, it would be guilty of ineptitude, of being immoral. Since morality lies in the consciousness of having fulfilled one's duty, this will not be lacking when the action is called cowardice any more than when it is called courage. The abstraction called duty, being capable of any content, is also capable of cowardice. The doer, then, knows what he does to be a duty, and since he knows this and the conviction of duty is the very essence of moral obligation, he is thus recognized and acknowledged by others. The action is thereby validated and has an actual existence. Paragraph 644 of Hegel's Phenomenology is continuing the movement that we've seen in the previous paragraphs, and it may in fact be useful to remind ourselves, since he's referring back to 643 about exactly what was being said at the end. And the last sentence of that reads, "For conscience, however, self-certainty is the pure immediate truth, and this truth is thus its immediate certainty of self, conceived of as content. That is, this truth is in general the caprice of the individual and the contingency of his unconscious natural being, his sense nature." And then Hegel continues by saying, this content, right, this Inhalt in German. So what content? The content of the individual who is existing, who senses, or rather, might be better to say perceives, because senses could mean in terms of like actually sensing through sense perception, perceives that he or she has certain duties. And I'm going to make a little bit of a digression here too in talking about this particular paragraph 644. There is going to be the use of the term duty, Pflicht, right? And then Miller translates another term that's very closely connected to it as moral obligatoriness. And in the German, that is Pflichtmäßigkeit, literally being measured by or commensurate with, or you might say fulfilling or being required to fulfill the duty, the Pflicht, right? So this is all about duty, moral obligation, we could say. And the question is, does duty exist, you might say, on its own in a purely abstract way, in that way that some moral theories, and you might think here in particular about Immanuel Kant, right, for whom duty is purely universal and can be formalized, and then we apply it to specific cases in very rigorous ways. Is duty something like that? Or, and here's what Hegel's trying to point out to us, is it more complicated than that when we get to actually existing and acting individuals who exist not only by themselves, but within a social matrix or fabric in which other people are selves, individuals as well. And I'm going to say another thing, which may seem a little bit of a digression as well. We're going to jump right to the very end of paragraph 644, what I've put here as being central. So the very last sentence runs like this. The doer then knows what he does to be a duty, and since he knows this, and the conviction of duty is the very essence of moral obligation, he is thus recognized and acknowledged by others. The action is thereby validated and has an actual existence. So there's an intrinsic connection at this point in the dialectic of morality and duty and conscience, Gewissheit, right? Which is what we've been running through as well. The doer knows what he does to be a duty. They are conscious not only in the choice, not only in the planning, but also in the action that they are fulfilling a duty. And he says, since he knows this and the conviction, Gewissheit, of duty is the very essence of moral obligation, Pflichtmäßigkeit, being, measured by the duty, being, recognizing it as a duty. He is recognized and acknowledged by others. Now, Miller is engaging in a little bit of what we can call pleonasm there. The German doesn't have recognized and acknowledged. It just has anerkannt, which could be translated as either one, right? Both of them are perfectly fine translations of anerkennen. And this is something worth reminding ourselves of, right? Because what is the entire dialectic of the phenomenology about? You might say something like, well, the development of consciousness throughout time and history, and that's Hegel's great contribution, reaching out towards the absolute. Yes, that's right. But how does it really take place? From self-consciousness on, we've known that consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit, the human being as such, is driven by a fundamental desire, a begierde, a hunger. What is that hunger for? Is it for domination? Not for domination as such. Is it for, the summum bonum as conceived of in traditional philosophy, whether that be God or, pleasure or virtuous activity for its own sake or whatever? No. Those are great, but those are not what is fundamentally driving the Hegelian dialectic. What is driving it is recognition, anerkennen, recognition that cannot be gained only from oneself, but from another human being. And so what we're seeing here is, I've pointed out many, many times that the struggle for recognition that happens in the self-consciousness section and leads into the master-slave dialectic, that is primitive stuff, right? That's not what Hegel is really interested in as such. This is the real stuff right here towards the end of the spirit section. This is where we have what seems like the possibility of gaining genuine recognition, complex recognition from other human beings. It's not happening as such in this passage, as we're going to see, because there is a bifurcation between my perspective as the agent and other people's perspective of what I'm doing. But that is what's going on here. So duty as one is, measuring oneself by it and appropriating it and applying it, you might say, is recognized by others, von anderen, right? By this, through this, the action, the Handlung, not merely the tat, the deed, but action, the comportment, the intentional way of behaving by a person, it thereby is valid, gültig. It counts, you could say. And it has, as Hegel says, actual existence. And this is where we can think of something quite interesting. What do you mean it has actual existence? Why wouldn't an action have actual existence? Wirklich, wirklich, actual, real, existence, Dasein, being there for something, right? When I do something, doesn't it already have existence? I pick up this book, right, and I page through it. That's an action. I say to myself, ooh, I'm learning Hegel. I sniff it, do whatever crazy actions I want. Those have existence. Yes, they do, but in a way, we could call it they have trivial existence. They have existence that is not being recognized as valid, as counting for something. It could be just as well as me, thumbing my nose from one side to the other. You look at that and you're like, what the hell are you doing? What's your game in playing around with your nose like that? Here's a little bit of a digression. We used to do this trick when we were kids, and I learned it from Mr. Griffin, who was a high school gym teacher and the friend of one of my classmates. He would put his hands like this, covering his nose, and then he would say, watch this, and he would make a cracking noise by using his thumb and his teeth, and it would look as if his nose had been cracked, just like when you crack a bone or something. And we'd get grossed out and scared until we learned the trick, right? Now, a cat might watch that, and a cat would see you doing this whole charade, and the cat doesn't care one bit about it. Same with your dog, right? Unless, maybe there's a bone or a ball involved or a treat or something like that. Human actions matter insofar as they're being recognized by others, and that is what gives them their actual existence. Actual existence is something different than what we might call bare reality or existence. So this is an important point, and we're getting to talk about how duty ends up with that. So again, a little bit of a digression. Now let's jump right into the text itself. So he says, this content, the content we were talking about in 643, at the same time counts as a moral essentiality or as duty, for pure duty, as was found when testing laws, is utterly indifferent to any content and tolerates any content. Now, when were we testing laws? That was towards the end of the reason section, was it not? Do you remember back in that portion of the text? And what happened back then? Well, Hegel is going to give you one example here. Hegel gave you several examples back then. So if this doesn't make complete sense to you, you might want to jump back into that section and take a look at the testing laws, moral laws, that he was discussing at that point. It's not testing laws in the sense of testing the law of gravity by carrying out scientific experiments. It's rather testing laws that reason ultimately shows it as giving itself, which have to do with specific duties, like to love your neighbor, for example, or in this case, to acquire property to provide for yourself and to be a useful member of society. So let's go on. He says, here it has, at the same time, the essential form of being for self, and this form of individual conviction is nothing else but the consciousness of the emptiness of pure duty and of the fact that pure duty is only a moment, that its substantiality is a predicate. So let's pause there for a second. What do we mean by this consciousness of pure duty is a being for itself? Well, it's conscious, it's inward, it's reflected upon itself, and it's lacking at this point a determinate content which would tell you what the duty is. We just know that I have an obligation, and we might even, go the Kantian route and say something like, well, that obligation had better have the form of a universalizable law that I can will, or, treats humanity as a means, or we use the third formulation, has to do with a kingdom of ends, that I can conceive of. All that stuff is very formal. And this is why students have a hard time with it when we look at, for example, Kant's groundwork, right? They're like, well, what are you talking about here? And it really only makes sense when we're able, as Kant does, to provide examples that then we can use to illustrate and test this out. And if you've ever, this is a bit of a side note, if you've ever read or studied or perhaps even taught Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals and gone through his examples, not everybody gets them all the time, right? Sometimes people look at them and they're like, I understand what he's saying about universal law. I don't see how this actually fulfills it. And Kant has to, admittedly, from a Hegelian perspective, do a little bit of a shuffle. What I meant by this is that you have to assume this, and it's not quite so straightforward or abstract and pure as it presents itself as being. So it reaches out, and it needs some sort of determinate content. Hegel talks about this pure duty as being the predicate of a subject. What is a predicate? What is a subject? We've talked about this many times. Hegel likes to use this in a rather metaphorical way. We can say that a duty is predicated of a subject in that the individual is told, you have the duty to do X, Y, Z, right? Or generally X, you have a duty of Y, you have a duty of Z. That's, making in some way the duty in its formal sense dependent on there being an actual agent, an individual who will accomplish the duty. So, here is where we get to the real meat. He says, its subject is the individual whose caprice is arbitrariness, Willkürlichkeit, right? So this caprice, as he says, gives it its content and can associate every content with this form and attach its conscientiousness to the content. So, the fact that I am an American going to be 50 years old soon, which means I belong to a certain generation, I have a certain social status, I have a wife, children, pets, neighbors, family members, all of those things are determinate. And to some degree, they are contingent and even arbitrary. I'll take for an example children, right? I have two of them, and children, you can plan for them all you like, but my experience of that is whatever planning you do, if it does in fact work the way that you think it's going to work, you're extraordinarily fortunate and lucky. Maybe actually not fortunate because maybe you planned badly, right? So for example, when my daughter was very young, because I grew up in a sort of semi-bilingual household where my mother spoke French with all of her relatives, tried to teach my dad French. She spoke French before she was 6, and then learned English after that, and always spoke with an accent. And my relatives would be over quite frequently. I grew up learning a kind of half-assed French that is, essentially a mixture of Québécois, French-Canadian, and the French that I then learned in school and all of that. And so I wanted to pass on a similar experience to my daughter. And so when she was a kid, growing up, as we were living in Indiana at the time, I would frequently speak to her in French, and it just did not stick. It just didn't work, And, I tried using certain techniques and stuff like that. And there were other relatives around because we were living on family land. It just didn't happen. And she never learned it. However, she's pretty good with Spanish, so it all turns out okay, which might be more useful for her anyway. Point is, here, why was I bringing that up? We're talking about arbitrariness or caprice, right? So there's the arbitrariness of who we are as individuals, and that example is kind of good too because it shows the arbitrariness of the efforts that we make to do what we conceive of as our duties. I thought I was giving her, a leg up. It'd be great if she knew 2 languages. This will help her out so much. I have a duty that I'm going to follow. It's not like the most important duty in the world, but it's something that would be good for me to do, and so there was a obligatoriness to it, and it failed, right? So there's arbitrariness in two senses. And we also, it's rather arbitrary, although Hegel is not really fleshing this out that well, it's rather arbitrary which things we pick up on. Think of the entire universe of potential duties out there waiting for us to recognize them, to bring them into our consciousness and say, aha, this is something I ought to do. And it could be all on the same level, like I have a duty to help this person, 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 and we only see one of them and we pick that one up. Why'd you pick that person and not this person over here? Arbitrary, right? You could have picked different ones, and you just happen to select those. So let's go on from here. He says, we can associate every content with its form and attach its conscientiousness to the content. So now Hegel's going to give us a great example here. An individual increases his property in a certain way. So, what are we talking about there? Could be investment, could be cultivating the land, and turning it from, wasteland to arable to fields that are cultivated to vegetables for the garden. It could be working for wages. It could be being an entrepreneur and developing a product and getting other people to work for you. It could be all sorts of things. But an individual increases his property in a certain way. In a certain way, not in every single way, not in every possible way, but in the way that they do it, through whatever productive, remunerative processes they are engaged in. How does Hegel view this? So there's two ways of viewing this that he talks about. He says the individual looks at it like this. Here's the universal duty. It is everyone's duty to provide for the support of himself and his family. So there's a duty of taking care of oneself, taking care of those connected with one. This could include your pets. This could include your aged mother-in-law. This could include people who you've adopted into your family structure. But there is you, and then there's a group that you are responsible for and have to at least do your part to take care of. It might not necessarily be going out into the workplace. It could be doing it at home, right? And educating the children and washing and cleaning and cooking and all that sort of stuff. But there's a duty there. And this is a duty of what he's a little bit later going to call maintaining one's own independence, meaning not becoming dependent on others insofar as you can avoid that. Not going on the dole, not becoming a parasite on other people and their productiveness. There's also another part. He says, no less do we have a duty to have regard to the possibility of being useful to our fellow men and doing good to those in need. We should not only make enough for ourselves, we should actually produce enough, appropriate enough, so that we can help out other people from the surplus that we have. So we've got a rich contexture here of duties that can be understood as the person hops in their car or gets on the train to go to work and walks into their office and sits down at their desk and looks at the calendar of what to do. They are fulfilling these duties thereby. Or, me teaching my students online or face-to-face, now a lot online, sitting down, opening up my laptop, checking in, seeing if there's any messages or emails, grading their assignments, creating new class content. I am fulfilling my duty to provide for myself and family and of being useful for others. Being useful for others, not just in what I do in the work, but also in what I do with the remuneration for that work. Sounds pretty good, right? And he goes on and he says, the individual is aware that this is a duty. This content is directly contained in his certainty of himself. He also perceives that he fulfills this duty in this particular case. Isn't this great? No, because other people look at it in a different way and they see other sides to this. He says, others perhaps hold this specific way of behaving to be humbug. They hold to other aspects of the concrete case. Every concrete case has multiple ways that we can look at it, and we choose which aspects we want to focus on. So this person is focusing on I'm doing a good job. I'm helping everybody out. I'm a productive member of society. And the other people say, you know what you're doing? You're actually doing violence, Gewaltigkeit. You're doing injustice, Unrecht. You're taking more than your fair share. Man, you got in my way. I could have had that job, but you took it instead. And why do you get to teach the online classes and everybody else is stuck doing the other stuff, right? That's the way that people can look at it. And, it's interesting if you think about this. How often have we been in these sort of situations where if it's us that are doing the thing, we're like, oh, this is great, the universe makes sense, I finally got what's coming to me, I'm going to help people out so much. And then when somebody else gets the job that we want or the opportunity, we're like, that SOB, they're depriving me. Why did they get the job and not me? It's because they've got this connection over here. It's not because they're any better than me. Blah, blah. We can think about all sorts of things like this. We can apply this, by the way, not just to remunerative work, but to love life. We can apply this to other opportunities that we think involve some sort of moral duties. And this is a reality of human social life, right? If we want to understand recognition, we have to acknowledge, I'm playing on the word there, right? There's an anerkennen in both ways, that other people get to have a say as well, that our telling people, oh, this is what I'm doing, doesn't have to be accepted by them. They can say, no, you're doing something different instead. So he goes on and he says, what others call violence and wrongdoing is the fulfillment of the individual's duty to maintain their independence in what they call cowardice. Cowardice, Feigheit, right? As opposed to courage, What they're calling cowardice is actually doing what one ought to be doing. So he says this cowardice is the duty of supporting life and the possibility of being useful to others. What they call courage would violate both of these duties. What would courage be? Tapferkeit, by the way. It would be to maybe hold off on taking one's fair share. And that's a weird way to talk about courage, particularly if we're thinking about being sort of assertive or entrepreneurial. This person is actually in some way more courageous, more daring by going out there and acting in a less passive and more, more assertive way, right? But others often find that to be problematic. So he goes on here and he says, cowardice cannot be so inept as to not know that preservation of life and the possibility of being useful to others are duties. So inept as to not be convinced of the moral obligatoriness of its action, and not to know that this obligatoriness, the Pflichtmäßigkeit, consists in knowing it to be such. Otherwise, it would be guilty of ineptitude. An interesting way of talking about it. Being kind of dumb, being kind of stupid, being immoral in this case. So he says, since morality lies in the consciousness of having fulfilled our duty, this will not be lacking when the action is called cowardice any more than when it's called courage. Regardless of what people call it, if you're the individual who's actually fulfilling his or her duty to provide for themselves and others, both those in the family and those in the larger society, through their work, which earns them some sort of living, it doesn't matter whether people call you courageous or cowardly, right? And the realization of that is getting us in some dim way to this recognition, right? Now, the recognition is not coming fully, and here's where we're going to end thinking about this. Hegel presents it as if, and by now you know the Hegel, sleight of hand that takes place here. Hegel's presenting it as if, okay, now we have the duty recognized by others. Well, yes and no. That's going to come, through the rest of this. That's not exactly happening now. People can call you a coward or say that you're engaging in injustice or unfairness by doing the things that you know are duty. But this is something that comes up with every concrete duty that we have. Any given person, any given other at any time can take offense to it and say that what you're doing is actually immoral rather than moral. But that doesn't mean that conscience can't be certain, at least to some degree, and remain certain of its having fulfilled its duties.